Hello and welcome to Stories Read and Written by Philip Ballerscheff. Again, as always, you can find a link to the stories that I read in the description of this video, and remember to like, share, and subscribe. This is a story called An Institution. Sitting in her living room, one leg slung over the other, she yawned a yawn that bared her teeth and left little else to the imagination. She went to cover her mouth, cupping her hand and giving it a slight bend. That was what the royals did when they waved, instead of the undignified hand flapping of the commoner. It was a turn of the wrist, not a flick. No, nothing so sudden as that. Maureen had the gloves she needed to complete the look. They were in the basement or in her closet somewhere, waiting to be dug out of the clutter. She dismissed the thought as soon as it came to her, and yet she still lay on her sofa, as exhausted as if she had actually done it. In these moods, even the thought of more work was tiring. She was tired from all the little things, tasks, impressions, and annoyances that had piled up over the course of her week, leaving her nearly unable to say why she felt how she felt. She had bought the sofa and then appointed herself in charge of its decoration, buying small pillows to go with its cream white color and pink flower pattern. Despite not being the same color, they fit well together. Something she was proud to have managed. She had heard, somewhere reliable too, if her memory served her right, that it was unhealthy to stop yourself from yawning. It had something to do with blocking the air from getting out. Caught between dignity and health, the second of which was part of the first, she was momentarily paralyzed with indecision. She had opened a window 10 minutes ago after her last yawn, and surely in that time the air should have gotten fresher. She opened the two remaining windows and stood right by them, so that she'd feel whatever airflow there was. Between the two of them, her husband was the more strident Republican. He had harbored these convictions ever since he was a young man, and nothing so far had proved him wrong. Maureen retained a little childlike fondness for the Queen as a figure of stability who, in an ever-changing world of prime ministers and their administrations, was the same except in her appearance after all these years. She had discussed these feelings with Jack with a therapist, and that was the conclusion they had come to. Jack was firm in his beliefs and unspeakably gentle in his manners. Most of his work for his cause consisted of standing on the street, handing out flyers to passers-by and talking to them, supporters and opponents alike. "I'm going to a league meeting," he'd tell Maureen, meaning their local Republican league. It was one chapter among the many that had sprouted up across the country, each varying in size according to the population and the percentage of people that wanted to join. His chapter numbered around 20 people. Gift shops sold pins and plates adorned with the faces of the royals, merchandise which their most loyal subjects bought and reverently preserved in their cabinets. Eating a meal off such a plate was unthinkable and would cut its value in half. The League had taken inspiration from this, though they made what they sold fit for regular use, not as collector's items. In choosing their symbol, the League had looked to the French Revolution for something to make a clean break with the monarchy. The French royal government had flown a golden fleur-de-lis atop a blue shield. The Paris militia that had stormed the Bastille wore a cockade in Paris's traditional blue and red. These colors, along with white, became the tricolor of the French Republic, which the revolutionaries hoisted in opposition to the king. The royal lineage in the current age survived exclusively by genetics. It was self-evidently illegitimate, its tradition supplanted by another, that of the nation and the republic. Of all the flags the British government had flown throughout its existence, none had remained in the public's mind besides the Union Jack, of which the League used a stylized version for their emblem. Monarchists used the flag too, and practically every major political party in the country called itself patriotic, however they chose to express it. The League's approach was to make being a Republican part of being British, rather than let the royals take something to which they had no right. Like any symbol, you could, with effort, time, and patience, separate it from what it now represented and reattach it to something else. The League sold lapel pins, badges, mugs, clothes, bags, stickers, posters, postcards, and every other possible product with which you could sell a message. These could be ordered online or bought in person from the narrow selection they brought with them and spread out on the tables by their stands. It had happened more than once that people took an interest in what they were selling, completely missing the message behind it, and were surprised to hear what the League stood for. In Jack's time manning the stand, a total of 3 people had asked for a refund. To Maureen, Jack was as curious a specimen as a taxidermist or a stamp collector, though his hobby was more usual than the first and less costly than both. She compared protesting to these alternatives, and came out of this thought experiment happy that she had it better than the women she imagined. Taxidermy produced stuffed corpses, and elicited glances and questions from guests. Stamp collecting as a whole, was too outmoded for her to find such a hobbyist as a husband without seeking them out. What amused her was that Jack's protests required something for him to oppose and another thing for him to support, and then, as if that wasn't already asking too much, a public to see him do all of that. He was generally respectful to everyone and lucky, and so he was never arrested. He slipped away from a crowd at the first sign of trouble, not caring who started it, and stood his ground against individuals. Knowing how well matched he and the average person were, the slim margin that separated them going in his favor on good days and otherwise in theirs. Jack was, in her eyes, a crank, one who kept a lookout for royal ceremonies of every sort, coronations, weddings, anniversaries, knightings, and lowliest of them all, commemorations. The last of these had happened recently, with the grand reopening of a train line that had fallen into disrepair, despite the efforts of the maintenance team. They could never make it perfectly spotless, not in the time allotted to them. To make that possible, the city had taken advantage of the days when some of their trains were not operational. The unveiling was soon scheduled, and then the project took on a life of its own, growing to larger and larger proportions until the station's previous name was no longer suitable. The line was renamed after a prince who had apparently so utterly failed in his duties to commemorate that his name and that of the train line now escaped her, despite the ribbons they had strung across the station's entrance for the prince to cut. The second worst and the most frequent target of Jack's ridicule were knightings. Those grabbed headlines, whereas the papers confined commemorations to somewhere far behind the front page, unless it was a very special occasion. Jack lost respect for any celebrity that chose to be knighted. He always had a little left over, hidden away, for those whom he wanted to keep admiring. The recipients, for their part, went ahead with their decision and didn't think of him once, and so, when Jack's disgust at their betrayal had subsided, he allowed himself to end his boycott of whatever they were involved in. This took around 2 to 3 days. More if the situation was egregious, less if there were extenuating circumstances, such as the person in question not being all there, or being prone, because of their character, to these and comparable outbursts. The title was an insult. Furthermore, it was a lie that the royals had any honor, let alone a surplus to give away. The idea behind the gesture, however ill-conceived, was that bestowing such a title honored the receiver by elevating their status, and also the giver by reaffirming their status as someone with the power to confer honor on people. It was the sort of gesture that can happen unspoken between friends, and which, with strangers, requires a ceremony for people to take it seriously, something Jack just couldn't do. Those who let themselves be knighted were debasing themselves for people that weren't worth their respect, and so they made themselves unworthy of Jack's respect as well. The ceremony was self-defeating, counterproductive for all involved. It was easy to be impressed with the associated pomp and pageantry, and hard to resist the temptation to be treated so well. Back in the limelight for a price. That's how he talked, with confidence, about things he couldn't possibly know. Nevertheless, she believed he was right. What put him slightly outside the mainstream was that he cared about his cause enough to campaign for it. If he lacked passion, how else could he have given up his weekends? On the whole, the public agreed with him. Polling the nation indicated he was in good company. Polling their household, a sample size of 2, there was nobody who got tearful at the sight of some duchess or other. The closest either of them came to that was sweet, indifferent Maureen, who saw the royals as one more institution that ruled her, and with so many rulers she couldn't muster up the anger or the focus necessary to take on one in particular and to tackle the next when the first was finished. Jack put it another way, and thought, therefore, that his opinions differed from her far more than they actually did. The monarchy would outlive him, that he was sure of, but it wouldn't outlive everyone. His job was to do his part, and not to let the impossible size of his task stop him from making his contribution. Her view was that, since it was pretty well impossible, it was best not attempted at all. It continually surprised him, long after he should have known, long after he had heard it the third and fourth and fifth time, how alike, though not the same, he and Maureen were in this regard and in others. When, after skulking around and thinking it over by himself, he asked Maureen outright what she thought of his protests, she replied that she supposed somebody had to do it. He was pleased. His smile, though it dimmed as she went on, stayed up. He sat, she said, comfortably between youthful idealism and elderly crankery, a description he held off from disputing because that was just what she needed to know she was right. 2 people were set to be knighted next month, a singer and an actor. Maybe their ascendance to knighthood would help her keep them in mind. She asked herself how she knew about the royals' knighting schedule, though she knew that only too well. Her husband's hobbies spilled over to her. To avoid them was impossible, try as she might, and she never had tried in the first place, seeing no reason not to learn about him, as he gave her the same courtesy. These ceremonies and similarly irrelevant days would have passed her by, had Jack not been as loyal to her as he was to the royals for the opposite reason. His memory was sharp, a fact he prided himself on, and liked to demonstrate by never using a calendar. It was for her benefit too, he said, since anyone could write down when their anniversary was. It took someone like him to learn those dates by heart. And where was he now? Off at a royal parade, not to cheer, but to be the odd one out and boo and make a fool of himself. And a fool he'd be, no matter how little resistance to his antics he encountered. She turned on the TV. The parade covered whole streets, and thus warranted being covered by multiple TV crews. She counted 6, then remembered the people filming the station she was watching and counted 7. Cameras panned over the parade and over the other TV crews. They and their equipment were simply part of the crowd, no more than that. Wherever the parade was, the reporter had announced it before she had tuned in, and wasn't going to repeat himself. It held the uncontested claim for the safest place in the country. How much that title must cost, Maureen wasn't sure. Her estimate ranged from the upper tens of thousands to the lower hundreds. See, she said aloud, speaking to herself as she did when she was alone. She liked the house to be quiet, so she could hear herself think, and what better way to hear her thoughts than to say them? "I'm becoming as much of a cynic as he is," she said. She couldn't help it and didn't want to if she could. Why turn away from the truth? Jack was right. It was a waste. For 5 more minutes she tried to enjoy the parade. She looked for her husband among the crowd and the rows of stands promoting causes obscurer than his Republican crusade. Causes ranging round the political spectrum. Some were so niche that the majority of the attendees hadn't given their ideas any thought, much less heard of the cause in question. These were single-issue groups, although, based on what they chose to focus on, she could usually guess the rest of their platform. It was rare that a party was as broad a coalition as it claimed to be. The longer the parade went on, the more she tired of it, and so she turned the TV off. So much money spent on her behalf, and she hadn't the decency to enjoy what the government did with her taxes. She had hardly seen the preamble to the theatrics of the main event. Well, what was she missing? Repetition was part of the ceremony. She knew how it went. The guards would march in their stiff formations, making each of their movements with a surety and purpose that only rehearsal can bring, turning fluidly within the boundaries set out for them, their legs either as ramrod straight as the rest of their body or bent at a perfect 90-degree angle. They'd spin and toss their rifles, turning all manner of tricks, and fail to entertain her. Had she continued watching, she might have found her husband as the camera surveyed the crowd again. Jack's stand was in the very middle of the people gathered there. By now they'd accepted seeing the parade from the distance they were at. They had pushed their way through up to here, trying for a clearer view, and this was where they could get no further. A shout came from out of the crowd. Jack saw a man approach and heard him grow louder. He threw accusations as if they were blows. "How dare you?" he said, not waiting for an answer. The closer he came to Jack, the angrier he became, anticipating what was to come. So blinded by fury was the man that, when his foot landed in a puddle, he withdrew his sopping wet leg and looked evilly at Jack, as if he had somehow had a hand in that. Reaching the stand, the man put his hands on his hips to affirm his authority and to catch his breath. That's how it went with some people. Anger was easier to provoke than support was to win. The latter stayed tucked away in the heads of those who walked by his stand and secretly agreed with what they saw. The former assaulted him, fortunately just with words. Jack stepped back from the edge of his tent to make room for the man, retreating to where the light of the cloudy day stopped. The man hurried through the rain that was dripping from the tent's roof to safety. To put it kindly, they exchanged views. Jack was better prepared for the weather and for the argument. It was an unusual ambush, one that was stationary and baited people into approaching the stand before they had time to collect their thoughts and compose themselves. Time to compose themselves and collect their thoughts. Had Jack earnestly tried to offer a counter-argument, the man would have talked over him. "So, do you see anything you like?" Jack interrupted, pointing to the table full of merchandise. "A badge, a pen? Are you running low on mugs?" Confused, the man stared blankly, wondering where he'd left off, and barked "No" when he'd found his place again. The discussion continued. The both men knew that someone somewhere must believe the opposite of what they thought. And yet they were surprised. Jack had vainly generalized his opinions to the rest of the country, counting those neutral to the monarchy as being for its abolition. He didn't expect to draw such controversy. Despite his assumption, he was moderate in his positions and in his personality, and would have described himself this way even if it weren't true. His goal, the goal of the League, was to shift public opinion by appealing to common sense, and from there to slowly build a movement and vote out vote out the royals by electing Republicans. It was a running joke in their chapter to say enough was enough. You'd end the monarchy right then and there with your own hands. He could have used such a zealot right about now, Jack thought. The man with whom Jack shared shifts held his hands at waist level, as if waiting for directions, and did nothing. The brave and vocal opposition that was within earshot, an even narrower category than that description implies, came over to see that the situation got no more out of hand than it already was. Leave him alone. Leave him alone. These were the words with which a woman shouted down a man twice her size and twice her weight and size. She and he flapped their gums and their arms at each other, she never putting her umbrella to use as a club, or for that matter as a spear. Its body was sturdy, and its points enticingly sharp, but she overcame her temptation. The man likewise passed up the advantages which his frame and the heft that kept it upright, muscle and skin and fat, afforded him over her. They glowered, pointed fingers, and were no more than harmless nuisances to the peace and quiet that had been there before and would return after this was over. Jack watched as she stood up for him, content to let her do the fighting that she felt this called for. Glad you got this out of your system, Jack said to the man as he left. The wind took the words out of his mouth and away from the man's ears. Had the man heard Jack's reply, he would have had more to say. Jack doubted the woman had it in her to go another round. His doubts were assuaged by the woman's cries of "Get out," which she directed at the man's back as he followed her directions. She hadn't cured him of his anger. Far from it. He had said his piece, and, having used up what emotion he had at his immediate command, wanted to turn his attention to more pleasant things. The woman asked Jack if he was all right. It was clear to both that the two of them were shaken up at most. I'm fine, thank you, Jack said. She looked at his merchandise for a moment, then glanced at him and said goodbye. A one-sided shouting match like that was a hard act to follow. The people that came afterwards engaged Jack in earnest conversation. His companion was ever ready with their flyers. Those that Jack couldn't fully convince left, at least, with more of an appreciation for his perspective. He was up to date on the royals' latest scandals, the escapades of the princes, the financial ties of the family, where their money went, and the courses it took finding its way back to them, through the dark channels of anonymous offshore bank accounts that helped them to avoid scrutiny. One of the challenges he faced was that time was both on his side and the royals for very different reasons. They lived on through inertia and the power they'd accumulated over the centuries of their reign, power which was slowly slipping out of their hands. Scandals were opportunities for him to get his foot in the door, while the idea of the royals was tainted, however faintly and temporarily. That was what he led with. If he sensed his audience was interested, he elaborated on how the royals had tied the court's hands so well that no judge could send them to jail. He followed their scandals to the best of his ability, being an inexperienced researcher and a hobbyist at that. If it was a hunt, it was one in which he was more the dog than the hunter, wholly reliant on his superiors. He read up on the work of investigative journalists and condensed their findings into speeches whose point was clear to all who heard them, including those who listened because they had no earplugs and no choice. He worked to impress upon people that wrongdoing was routine for the royals, contrary to what the short-sighted outrage that was being drummed up would suggest. Here he had, by practice, learned not to stumble over his words, learned where the pitfalls were and how to steer clear of them. The distinction he made was as follows. For the royals, this was business as usual. They pretended it wasn't, and that was how they protected themselves. First they hushed up. If that didn't work, they singled out the most obviously guilty family member, the one whose reputation took a beating every year, and blamed them. This placed the family out of harm's way. The public outrage that followed such revelations attacked the scapegoat and not the rest of the family. All but the deliberately innocent saw how the royals abused their power. Those who supported them argued it was only the black sheep of the family doing what they always did. The question wasn't whether they were in trouble, but what kind it was. Any talk of budget cuts, and he was there to pin the fault on the culprits, who were, he said, enjoying the look of confusion this caused in his listeners, the ultimate benefit scroungers. The tabloids combed the country for terrible cases of fraud. Reading the tabloids every day gave you a broad array of examples to choose from, a gallery of people, each of whom had tricked the welfare office into letting them live at the taxpayer's expense. The individual amounts they took changed, and as the years passed, so did the rules they flouted. The core principles behind the investigation The core principle behind such investigations was so fundamental that it was able to resist nearly all innovation. Someone stole your taxes. Here's how their scheme worked, and here's why they did it. Committing fraud and exposing it both took a certain finesse, but neither was commendable, not for the skill required, nor for the end to which it was put. Not when there were far worse cheats for whom the papers, aside from a select few, had nothing but fawning admiration. Jack did his spiel, and then out came the petitions and the mailing list. Sign up and receive their yearly newsletter. The higher a member was in the league, the more they were paid for the time they dedicated. That ensured the higher-ups were professionals. Jack was happy to volunteer for free. He didn't take every chance he got. Doing so would get him labeled obsessed by whoever he made sick of hearing about the royals, which was deadly for his cause and personally unpleasant. His dislike of them was comparable to his fondness for the people he'd met in the movement, part of his personality and not fundamental to it. There are those who can't get out of bed without something to feel good or bad about. Jack wasn't one of them. He was great at rallying round what concerned the person he was trying to convince. A royal parade was a great inconvenience to hundreds of drivers, a fact he emphasized to the people walking by. Jack had learned how to speak loudly and surely, and then to quiet down quickly from the volume of an excited sports announcer missing his microphone to what he, as in his youth, called his indoor voice. People didn't stay around for long to make their case or to hear his. They had things to do and warmer places to be. So did Jack when his shift ended. He tramped home, his parka slick and shiny with rain. His tent had saved him from the worst of it. The street lights came on at evening, no earlier. The sky was dark, though not as dark as it would be then. The sun was gone. Soon the rain would be too. The air was clear, the clouds more defined in their form and in the various shades of purple and blue which the sun cast them in. He hung his parka up in the shower, where it could drip and dry in peace, and told Maureen about his Saturday. 2 birds had made a nest in their neighbor's roof. The birds' chirping, softened by distance, flitted between their words. Jack reported to Maureen on the public mood, which, like that of a crowd, was hard to gauge in the best of times, assuming all were honest and open and willing to approach him to make their voices heard. He told her that a red-faced man had nearly charged at him. She raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Oh," she said. "Well, no," Jack said, trying to tell the story right. "No?" Maureen teased. What the man actually did was stomp over with frightening speed. That would have been greater if he hadn't been so angry. Jack, having nothing with which to stop his advance, didn't try, and watched him approach the stand. The man was angry and fat and old, all of which, alone and together, would explain his color. Maureen shook her head at her husband and at the people he met because of what he did with his time. What did he do to you? She asked, awaiting an answer that would justify the fear she felt, despite seeing that there was nothing wrong with him. Some yelling. I tried to sell him a badge. He said he didn't want one, and that was the end of it. A lot of fuss and no harm done. And what did you get up to while I was away? She was stumped. For all the time that had passed, she hadn't done much. She told him what she could remember. I watched the parade, and I tried to find you. I saw lots of people in parkas, but you could have been any one of them. I'll be sure to wave next time, Jack said. How about that? That was An Institution, written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. Again, if you'd like to read along to the stories that I read here, you can find a link to my blog in the description. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks, and until next time.